Live streaming is on.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar in our Shepherd and Wedderburn Net Zero series. I'll come on in a second to talk about today's event, but before I do that, if I could just mention that we have our next event in the series on transport decarbonisation is on the 18th of August, and details of that event and sign up link is in the resources section of your screen at the right hand side if you'd like to click on that at some point. So turning to today's webinar, I think it might be useful if I just actually read very briefly what the Climate Change Committee said on the 24th of June in its press release. It said the government has made historic climate promises in the past year, for which it deserves credit. However, it has been too slow to follow these with delivery. This defining year for the UK's climate credentials has been marred by uncertainty and delay to a host of new climate strategies. Those that have emerged have too often missed the mark. With every month of inaction, it is harder for the UK to get on track. So, with those words ringing in our ears, who better to comment on and expand on what the Climate Change Committee was saying a little over a month ago than the Chief Executive of the Climate Change Committee. We are very pleased to have Chris Stark with us this morning. Since Chris has held that role as Chief Executive since April of 2018, and before that he was Director of Energy and Climate Change at the Scottish Government, preceded by a stint at none other than Her Majesty's Treasury. I'll also briefly introduce our discussant this morning, Dermot Nolan, who also joins us. Dermot has already appeared in one of our earlier webinars. It's very good to have him back. Dermot is a director at Fingleton. He's been in that role since July of 2020, and before that he was the Chief Executive of Ofgem, following a career in regulation in Ireland, where he chaired the Commission for Regulation of Utilities. So today's running order will be roughly as follows. I'll ask Chris to make some opening remarks about the work of the committee and its recent publications. I'll then invite Dermot to offer his comments on what Chris has said, and then we'll open a Q&A session. For the Q&A session, we'll be very interested to see what you would like us to discuss and the questions you've got. So please use the Ask a Question function in the right-hand side of your screen to post questions, and we will endeavour to address those in the Q&A segment. So, having said all of that, Chris, if I could hand over to you for your introductory remarks.
Yeah, thanks, Gordon. Just check you can hear me.
Yes, very clear.
Very good. So thanks very much for inviting me on this morning at what feels like the kind of start of the summer season. So nice time to reflect. And I thought just for kind of maybe 5 or 10 minutes, I'd just give you a sense of what we've been up to in the Climate Change Committee and some of the things that we've been seeing. I mean, I think you very neatly summarised how we are feeling at the moment with that opening quote from our most recent publication. But actually what we've been doing recently is completing these 5-yearly cycles that we have under the Climate Change Act of assessing the path to the climate targets for our carbon emissions, and also assessing climate risk and how well adapted we are to changes that are coming from climate change itself. So it's been a really important period for us. The way that the Climate Change Act works, we have to do this every 5 years. So we advise on a carbon budget, and we advise on the latest climate change risk assessment. Annoyingly for us, those two things come within 6 months of each other under the Climate Change Act. So it's always a sort of mad rush to complete all of the things that we need to do just at the end of that 5-year cycle. And now we sort of emerge from that chrysalis-like into thinking about what happens next. But such an important period for us. Over the last 6 or 7 months, what we produced is the third climate change risk assessment for the UK, the advice on the sixth carbon budget, which is an absolutely critical piece of advice on where we need to be by the mid-2030s, and 2 progress reports to Parliament on assessing progress against climate change adaptation and mitigation. So I thought I'd start with climate risk because it's so topical. I feel that we are now very much coming to terms with the implications of climate change itself. People in this country and around the world are, I think, seeing now climate change happening. You just need to look at the events of Germany and Belgium recently, the extraordinary temperatures in North America, with this new term. There's always a new term from the weather forecasters of a heat dome, not one that I knew before that. We're seeing wildfires, flash flooding in London even recently. These are the impacts of climate change. We are now at a point when we've warmed the planet since industry began by 1.2 degrees centigrade on average. It's about the same in the UK, but there are parts of the world where there is much higher temperature increase going on. The last 6 years have been the 6th warmest on record globally. So that steady increase in temperatures, about a quarter degree centigrade every decade now, is driving change in the climate. It's driving change in the weather we're seeing here in the UK as well. Annual average temperature has been warming actually at about 0.3 degrees centigrade per decade in recent decades in the UK. So we're slightly ahead of the global average recently on recent increases in temperature. Heat waves now much more common, more intense when they happen. They tend to happen for longer across the country. Cold extremes also significantly less likely. We're seeing also a signal of climate change in some of the extreme heavy rainfall events like the flash flooding in London recently. And recent events around the world are very much in line with climate change and very much in line with what scientists have been warning about for recent decades. So the worrying thing actually is that the North American heat dome probably stepped outside of the extremes that were modelled, despite lots of people over the years saying that modelling looked pessimistic. So it's not a great place to be. And that's just where we are now. If we look forward, I think that's the most interesting thing. If we look forward, what can we expect? Interestingly and worryingly, I suppose, before 2050, the projected changes in the climate that we will see, especially in the UK, don't actually differ very much depending on the trajectory of global emissions. So I'm afraid it's inevitable that we're going to see warmer, wetter winters in the future. We're going to see hotter, drier summers. The 2018 summer heat wave is something we looked at extensively in the recent reports that we produced. That's going to be the kind of event that we see 50% of the time. So a 50% chance of a 2018 summer heat wave by the time we get to 2050. And with that, rainfall extremes, temperature extremes, more intense, more frequent. Sea level is also going to continue to rise. So that's the pre-2050 position. And of course, we have to adapt to that because that's baked in now. It's actually beyond 2050 that the global efforts to cut greenhouse gas emissions really come into play. Put another way, the changes in the UK's climate are going to depend on whether we're successful in progressing the global challenge of net zero. And that, of course, is the topic we'll be discussing in COP26 extensively. If we look at the median pathways for the current global ambition on emissions, we're going to get to somewhere between 3 and 4 degrees centigrade by the end of the century. And that is hugely troubling. I mean, it's catastrophic. So it's difficult to present that actually in a coherent way because you're seeing already the impacts at 1.2 degrees centigrade of warming. Think of how difficult it would be if we got to 4. And we've assessed that range of outcomes between 2 and 4. 2 degrees, well below 2 is the Paris outcome, that of course we all want to see happen. 4 degrees is still on the table as a potential outcome. And it means that we need to think about this as a risk. So when we looked in May, at the risks that the UK faces from those kind of changes overall, we assessed 61 risks that the UK faces from climate change. And that was our third climate change risk assessment as required by the Climate Change Act. And we really wanted to get across the magnitude of the climate risks that we now face. Genuinely poor planning for the extent of the risks that we face now. Overall, we found that the overall level of risk had actually gone up since our last assessment 5 years ago. So if you think about that, that means that our preparations for climate change itself are not keeping pace with the escalating risks, and that's very concerning. So big push from us to do something about that, to make adaptation more of a topic, give it the prominence that I think it deserves. A big message also from us on the need to plan for adapting to climate change alongside all the other things that we're doing across the country, including net zero. So top of the pile really is this idea that we need to plan for adapting to climate change, because we know a lot of this is going to happen, sadly, and also plan for net zero. And it's great that we have net zero and that it's forcing us longer term outlook from the government. But that planning, of course, needs to recognise that we're going to have different climatic conditions when it comes to achieving net zero over the next 30 years or so. So really important, if we just think about that net zero challenge now, and the progress that we're thinking on moving, and the progress that we need to make on reducing emissions in the UK. So if I just come to that next. In December last year, we produced another one of our tomes. That was our advice on the 6th carbon budget, which is the period in the mid-2030s. And every 5 years, we set one of these carbon targets, of course, in law. And I'm very, very proud of that work that we produced in December. We built 5 separate scenarios for the UK for achieving net zero by the statutory date. One of those scenarios actually got there early. We deliberately put together a scenario for getting there as quickly as we felt it was possible to do so. We got there 8 years early by 2042. And we now have a really rock solid basis for assessing what needs to happen across the economy to get to the statutory targets. The headline of that analysis back in December was that we needed to set a new emissions target that meant that in effect that we would have to reduce emissions by at least 78% by 2035 from where they stood in 1990. That's the implication of the net zero target. So we've effectively brought forward the old 80% target by 2050 by 15 years. So that tells you something about how much more ambitious the UK will need to be to meet net zero. Happily and remarkably, that advice was accepted by UK ministers just a few weeks ago. So we are now locked into that pathway. That is now the legal target for the UK. So we have our net zero goal by 2050. And we have this at least 78% by 2035 goal now set in law. That's the 6th carbon budget. Just to give you a sense of what that requires in our assessment, we'd need to double the size of the electricity system by 2050. 80% of that we think can be supplied by renewables. We have scenarios that go higher than that. So that's a big shift in electricity, of course. Hydrogen supply, which is the accompanying new energy story alongside renewable electricity, of course. That grows from almost nothing to being 2/3 of the energy output of electricity of electricity today. So think of that, a massive new change in our energy system by 2050. Natural gas consumption down by 3/4 by 2050, oil down by 85%, consumption of meat down by 1/3 onto some of the more difficult consumer choices. With that, big changes in land use. So as we change agricultural land over to nature restoration and storing carbon in the land, big shifts there, taking forest cover from about 15% of the UK today to 20% of the UK by 2050, and also very substantially restoring peatland. All sorts of shifts there, and very much the product of a very deep consideration of how we build up progress in every sector to cut emissions. So putting the policies in place, building the supply chains to deliver those changes that we need, stimulating investment, learning by doing, of course, scaling up the deployment. A huge undertaking, but really worth it. So some of the most important work in the 6th carbon budget advice was actually on the economics, I think. We assessed that we need a lot of extra investment to get to net zero, an extra £50 billion of capital investment across the economy per year from 2030 onwards. And that's mainly private investment. So we need to get the incentives right to make sure that that happens. It's mainly about transport infrastructure, about energy supply, energy networks, the buildings challenge, of course, heat with it, and industry decarbonisation. They're the big investment priorities. Most of that investment can be done with normal investment and asset replacement cycles, was our assessment. So we can minimise the disruption over the course of that transition to net zero, and we can avoid stranding assets as far as possible. We have key dates for the phase out of the sale and the use of the fossil fueled assets that we're using extensively across the economy today. But it's a major undertaking, and it's going to require policy, of course, to drive that change over the next decade and beyond. It will need to be financed, but we don't see a problem with that as long as the strategy from the government is clear about what needs to be achieved, and that we've got the appropriate kind of enabling policies and frameworks in place to make sure that investors can get a return from all of that. So really strongly positive story actually on the economics of green, which we now think have moved fundamentally towards especially the clean energy that we need. We see huge savings to consumers as those investments play out across the economy. So as we use those low carbon technologies, the electric cars, the heat pumps, the wind farms, that saving grows over time from using those assets, and that offsets those very large investment costs. The aggregate impact of that is that we've got a very low cost across the economy, less than 1% of GDP in every year out to 2050. So that's the prize, I suppose, not just addressing climate change, but this big investment perspective. But of course, we need a plan for that. So coming to the very last point I want to make this morning, that strategy from government which guides all of that, backed by the Treasury, is what we don't have. I'm afraid we just haven't got that yet. And it is yet. I'm hoping it will come in the autumn. If we look at the progress that we're actually making in the UK in cutting emissions, you can definitely see in the UK we are doing better relative to other economies around the world. And that's a great story. Best in class, really, kind of best in the G20 progress. That's great, but it's not enough. If you look pre-pandemic, we had this relatively steady progress in the decade prior. Most of the progress, though, was happening in the power sector. During the pandemic, we probably got to this kind of magic figure of almost halving emissions from where they stood in 1990. But that's a kind of false sense of progress, really. Outside of the electricity sector, if you look in the other sectors, which of course we need to decarbonise as well, if we were to remain on the same pre-pandemic trend we were on, then we're going to miss the sixth carbon budget by a huge margin. So policy progress outside of the power sector really needs now to come through. And when we look for that, I'm afraid the current strategy from the government is really is found wanting. We've looked in assessing the progress that's happening at the moment. We looked at broadly two issues, two big issues: the ambition that the government has set and the policy progress that we've seen from the government. On ambition, really my kind of last point here. This is great. You know, we are seeing an increase in the ambition from especially the Prime Minister and the 10-point plan last year. Just under half of the ambitions now outlined by the government, we rate as being on track or potentially on track. So half, that gives you a sense of the gap that needs to be closed on ambition. But when we look at policy, that is credible policies funded and actually being delivered, we're miles off track. So when it comes to that question of credible policy, we reckon those policies only cover about a fifth of the required emissions reductions to meet the sixth carbon budget. So the truth is that we've been pretty disappointed by progress this year from the government. Lots of delayed strategies that had been promised and haven't yet been delivered yet. For those strategies and policies that we've seen, they tend to just miss the mark from where we were in the sixth carbon budget advice in December. So we're off track for the fourth carbon budget. We are off track for the fifth carbon budget. We are off track for the 2030 emissions target that we submitted to the UN in December. And that's not really a great place to be for the COP president as we shape up for COP26. But lots of potential to change that, especially with the net zero strategy that's due from the government in autumn. We're also expecting something from the Treasury. Long-awaited policies and strategies like the heat and building strategy also look like they're being parked for the autumn. So the autumn really now does look like the big moment in climate policies. And we really need that to work. It's 2 years since we set net zero in law. And of course, every month that passes, every week that passes without those new policies makes it harder and harder to get on track and more expensive to get on track. So my last point really is to say that all eyes now are really on the government for their net zero strategy in the autumn. And I really hope that they can fill that vacuum, as we called it, the policy vacuum that currently exists. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chris. That was a real tour de force and a real sense of urgency in what you're saying for government, for policymakers. I wonder if I could turn now to Dermot. Just having listened to what Chris has had to say and having studied what the Climate Change Committee have thrown down in terms of the challenge, what your own reflections are.
Thank you, Gordon. And, again, hope people can hear me very, very Pleased to be back with Shepherd and Wedderburn, and thank you for inviting me. I did warn Gordon when he did invite me that, I tended to agree with nearly everything generally that Chris says. So I said you may not get a huge amount of variety in terms of speaker input. And I really did agree with everything he said there. I also found it deeply sobering the way he said it. I think it was very powerful as a piece of rhetoric and obviously a piece of analysis as well. So I will keep my comments brief. I mean, I have this slight, on terms of the science, which is in some sense outside my ken, it is so sobering and actually in some ways deeply irritating how much the science has been proved true. And I remember even a few years back, people saying the science is all wrong. And I feel a deep irritation towards such people. I'm not saying with an Ofgem we embrace this and as much as we should have. And, my irritation in some sense is irrelevant, but it is annoying, frankly, and still annoying how much the climate change denial science has gone on and to some extent still goes on. I did see with a certain degree of glee that Exxon, who was probably one of the chief deniers for many, many years, has finally been sort of quasi taken over in this regard. But still, I'm still disturbed just as the evidence mounts up, just how much sort of sense there is of, this still isn't quite happening, or it's an anomaly. But in fact, all it is doing is showing that the predictions made years back seem to have been accurate. In terms of what Chris said then, I think there is an element then, when I came before, I berated the government. This was speaking on the webinar back about 2 months ago or 3 months ago. I berated the government for sort of not making enough progress. Now, it is the easiest thing in the world to berate anyone for not making progress. Certainly, that was my fate in Ofgem for many years, and I was often berated quite fairly. But I think what is depressing is that 2-3 months on, we are still in the same position. So as Chris said, the ambition is very palpable. The ambition is very strong. That came out particularly in December last year with lots of ambition, as it were. But the lack of progress in the last 6 to 9 months, the lack of concrete and detailed progress is very sobering. I know these issues are very hard for government to deal with. They're just not easy issues. But as Chris has made clear, the imperative is sufficiently strong that they simply have to be dealt with. As Chris said, now the focus is all on autumn. I don't want to be sort of too churlish about things, but government was saying 2 months ago the focus was we will have all these strategies. We will have the heat strategy. We will have the hydrogen strategy. We will all have them out by the time Parliament goes into recess. The Parliament went into recess, I think, last week, and we have not seen these strategies. So there is an element of, I think I've used the phrase before, of waiting for Godot about all this. We're wondering, will Godot ever actually arrive? And unfortunately, a sort of situation where the stage, shall we say, is getting hotter and hotter to the point the actors won't be able to live in it very further is not a terribly useful image to have. I will actually kill this metaphor at this stage because it's gone too far. but nonetheless, it is depressing how little has been achieved in terms of the actual plans. I think if I was picking one area out, and again, I think this is something Chris has said before, so I'm probably just copying him. It is in consumer response and demand issues, which I think is most palpably lacking. Even in ambition terms, we see ambition, we see certainly discussion about strategy for actual physical investments. There's still ongoing issues, I say as an ex-regulator, about the cost of such investments. And we see, as we know, at the moment, there's an appeal still going on between all the network companies and Ofgem about the cost or the return at which such investments will be compensated at. But despite all this, I remain mildly confident, maybe I'm being too glib, but I remain mildly confident that that kind of network level investment will take place. As Chris said, the costs in many ways have come down. The costs to society are not that high. They're not trivial, but they're not that high once we start using the new sort of technology. But what depresses me still is the government's perceived lack of a plan for consumer issues, a perceived unwillingness to regard this as a really fundamental problem and to try and take active steps to stimulate consumer response. And it is this unwillingness, I think, that is the single biggest problem with this strategy in so much as it exists. So I am nervous about the government's ability to bring forward a detailed plan in sufficient time. And I'm doubly nervous that even if and when it does, there will not be enough about consumer response. There will be not enough about how to fund the kind of investments that are needed at a consumer level. So Chris's point that once people start using EVs, once people start using heat pumps, various other technologies, the costs will go down. I'm disturbed again that the Treasury report has not yet come with a sense of how these consumer investments would be funded. So I think, as I said, it is the easiest thing in the world to criticize, but I think Chris and the Climate Change Committee's report are incredibly important, deeply disturbing, and yet presenting a ray of optimism. And I really hope the government does finally deliver on this autumn strategy, because frankly, it bloody well needs to. That's not a very coherent end, but it really does.
Spoken with passion. Can I just begin and I just encourage people in the audience to post questions, as I said at the beginning. Please do so, and we will try to cover them. Can I just come back then to this question, Chris, of the ambition gap and the more worryingly perhaps the policy gap, and ask you to say a little bit more, explore a little further this question of the demand side policies. And when you've, as a committee, you've gone into a great deal of detail in terms of what can be done. So is it worth just exploring a little bit what, particularly on the demand side, could be done, what the sort of the objections that one typically would expect to have on those demand side policy innovations, and how you'd, if you like, respond to those in terms of the difficulties? Yeah,
it's become a thorny topic. I suppose it's always been a thorny topic. What changes in lifestyle, what changes in consumption, what changes in demand might we as a country be willing to make? And I don't mind saying this. I rather feel the government's painted itself into a corner on this. So I'm tired of hearing that the Prime Minister will not tolerate a meat tax. Well, I don't want a meat tax either. So I think there's a sort of there's rather too much kind of binary discussion of this. I actually think the country's in a much more interesting place than ministers give it credit for. So I think that changes in lifestyle are inevitable as we go through this transition, and I think a lot of those are something that people are willingly running towards. So just to give you a sense of that, in the assessment that we've made, the big steps forward in cutting emissions are still largely about technological progress. So they're still about using low carbon technologies, instead of the high carbon technologies we use today, the cars, the gas boilers, the industrial machinery. That is a big part of the progress that we need to make. But that there's a big role for changing our demand for high carbon goods and services as well. And there's a big role for becoming more resource and energy efficient in the overall pathway that we presented to the government in December. In fact, it's doing most of the work over the next 10 years because we haven't sadly been doing enough to change the infrastructure requirements in sectors outside of power. So you need these changes in consumption and demand to deliver the carbon targets that we have. And some of that is about difficult political questions like diet. But some of it is about, I think, much less difficult questions about changing slightly consumers' preference for traveling by different modes of transport, for example, becoming more energy efficient in the home, using different devices that happen to be more energy efficient along the way. So what I would like to, I suppose, get to a more grown-up discussion about all of this. When we think about the most difficult of those topics, I think it probably is diet. So, the shift in diets that we've projected, it's about a change of about maybe 20% to a third in consumption of meat that we've got in our pathways. Could be more, could be less. That is a shift, no doubt. But I happen to believe that is more or less the kind of position that we'll end up with anyway, especially if you look at the kind of advice that's already offered for healthier diets from the government. So you see this change already in demographics between older generations who do eat more meat and younger generations who are eating more fruit and veg or more vegetarian food. So that kind of thing, if we embrace it, helps immensely with a whole host of things. Firstly, it will help reduce emissions from livestock, of course. Now, that's a difficult topic for the farming community. But crucially, that frees up agricultural land to then do some other things with that land, like planting trees. And that's a new revenue stream for farmers. So we need to get to a point where we're talking in more grown-up sense about what the kind of changes we will see will look like, the extent to which we can support those changes with better information provision, better standards as well. And then I think we will get to a position where net zero itself will become easier. And I really feel that that's a gap in the government strategy at the moment. It looks actually like a schism between what we've said in December and what the government itself is planning to do in the autumn, insofar as we know that. So I hope that's something that the government is thinking more progressively about and will be more willing to make policy on in the future. But at the moment, it doesn't look that way.
I'm reminded as you're talking about advice of the Al Capone quote, which is he always felt one achieved more with a gun and a kind word rather than just a kind word. And I was wondering, in terms of the way in which those policy levers are pulled, advice will get you so far, but things like the tax system or other forms of harsher levers, if I can call it that, surely have a role to play. And I wonder if Dermot might want to comment on that, and also in commenting on that harshness point, perhaps also maybe open up a little strand around fairness, because I think some of these levers might be seen by some as regressive or falling inequitably around the population.
Just briefly, I mean, I'm not sure if I'm necessarily recommending the Al Capone approach, but nonetheless, I think it is salutary, Gordon. But Chris's points about diet and food are probably the most sensitive areas. And I actually spent the weekend in Dublin, where Ireland has just broadly done a sort of legal commitment to climate change or to net zero, which is, I would describe as an almost net zero. And the main issue that is governing the almost is the concern about agriculture, the concern about food patterns in particular. But Ireland exports a lot of food. And in that sense, in Britain, we are, frankly, in a somewhat better position than many countries that have high agricultural sectors. Where in Ireland, if you compare Ireland with GB, you get the three major issues of heat from buildings, transport, electricity generation, but you have the fourth of agriculture, which is nearly the same size. So we are, and really, to be quite blunt, the Irish government is absolutely terrified of this. It's terrified about even saying anything about agriculture becoming a less important sector, and it's terrified about telling Irish consumers that they may need to change their eating habits. So I do understand the difficulty for government. I do understand how tricky it can be to embrace these issues. As Chris said, however, we're already in that direction. There is a movement on healthy eating, which is pushing us in that way. Would I use taxes to do so, to help move in that situation? I would, because I'm an economist who tends to believe in carbon taxation and signals. So I probably would use tax. But that's a personal view, and I'm not sort of the dictator of the UK, unfortunately, which a lack of which I feel every day. But
likewise.
but I would actually use such taxation instruments. I mean, the classic. I am sort of sounding like the classic economist who waves his hand and says, "Well, all we need to do is get good carbon pricing, and that's fine, and then net zero will happen." And I know it's not that simple. On the distributional aspects, again, perhaps very unfairly, I'm really disappointed with the lack of a comprehensive paper from the Treasury on the impacts and on the funding. This is a particularly gratuitous remark, and it was not made by me, I hasten to add, but it was made by someone I know well, who said to me the paper that was produced before Christmas by the Treasury on this issue read like a long undergraduate essay. And I think that is, if anything, being kind to it. So I know it's been very difficult to grasp it. But I don't, in terms of the Treasury, which is clearly the expert body in this area, I have no sense on which it really understands how the kinds of changes that will need to happen will affect the distribution of income. And I have also no sense on how it plans to fund sort of the consumer investments that will be made. As we know, heat pumps are not cheap. I don't know the exact cost, but maybe 5,000 might be a reasonable figure. How are you going to fund that for ordinary households if heat pumps become the standard, if you will, for decarbonizing heat in the next 20, 30 years? Is everybody supposed to lump up that sum initially or not? I don't know. But again, I'm disappointed, which is very easy to be, with the Treasury's lack of clarity as to distributional effects and indeed funding mechanisms for consumers. As I said, ultimately, a large network company, okay, maybe it and Ofgem are wrangling, but a large network company or company investing in hydrogen will be able to fund its issues. Whether consumers will be able to fund the technology they need, and Chris has referred to, is far less clear to me.
And Chris, can I I was going to ask you to comment as an ex-Treasury mandarin yourself in terms of this tax question and fairness, but we've also had a question, another demand side, I suppose, question come in relation to the role of the public sector itself as a buyer and the way in which public sector buying decisions might actually, I suppose it's an easier thing to control on the demand side than necessarily individual consumers. What your views on that are?
Yeah, two really important topics. So maybe just kind of following on from Dermot's point earlier about the incentives and carbon pricing and all of that. We desperately need that thinking from the Treasury. We desperately need it. We've needed it for years, actually. I mean, one of the best things that has happened in the last few years. In 2019, we gave our advice on the net zero target, and this came from me as an ex-Treasury employee. I was acutely aware of the fact that the Treasury, you can almost personify it, actually. It's the sort of brightest young boy, and is a boy in the class, and he doesn't respond well to being told what to do. So the kind of the thing we did in 2019 was we said to the Treasury, look, we've done all this technical work to say that net zero target is the right target for the UK. There's a need to do the equivalent work on the economics of net zero, but it's best that you do it. So we put to them a challenge to a recommendation to review the funding of net zero across the piece, and they accepted that. So we are still waiting for that review. We had hoped that we would see it before summer. It now looks much more likely that we'll see it in the autumn, along with the fiscal event and the strategy. And it's essential that we see that, because the incentives for decarbonisation are a mess at the moment, a real mess. They have been for several years, but they are particularly messy now. And that covers off some of the issues about consumption that we've been talking about. It's presenting a real barrier now to progress on one of the most important transitions ahead of us, which is the heat transition. We've got this real oddity at the moment where you've got all of the tax discounts on the gas bill, and you've got all the policy costs sitting on the electricity bill. Now we want people to use that electricity because we've been doing very well at decarbonising it recently. So the incentives are all wrong there. And if you want people to switch to heat pumps, I mean, remarkably, heat pumps are almost at cost parity with gas boilers in some circumstances at the moment, despite that disbenefit that there is in the incentives at the moment. So we need some clever thinking about that. Many of us, like me, are on dual fuel tariffs. You could see a situation where you switch that situation I've just talked about, where you start to progressively add the tax onto the fossil fuels and move the policy costs off the thing that you want people to consume, the clean electricity. That would be an interesting one. The other one is the transport taxes. Rishi Sunak has 28 billion reasons to worry about this 2030 commitment that the Prime Minister has made to stop selling petrol and diesel cars, because fuel duty revenues are going to start to drop and dwindle, and we'll need some sort of replacement for that. So there is lots of thinking, I know, going on about things like road charging and road pricing and alternative ways of recovering that lost revenue. But we need that to be in the right place too. And I'm just going to make this point, actually, that the overall cost of net zero in aggregate is now extremely low. In fact, I happen to believe it's not cost at all if we do it right, because there's all sorts of benefits that come with this. And that investment program alone over the next 10 years, as we come out of a pandemic and a recession, is a huge boon to the economy when you've got lots of spare capacity. But, let's, take a conservative outlook. There is still a small cost, but it's tiny. It's close to zero now. But that's the aggregate position. And beneath that, there are real costs to real people and consumers and real businesses in this country, particularly on that heat transition that we need to achieve, and particularly on industry decarbonisation. And we'll need to capture some of the benefit, because we think it's now cost saving to decarbonise transport. So we'll need to capture some of that benefit to help pay for the costs in heat and industry. So that requires a plan. It requires fiscal policies that are not really in the right place at the moment. And I don't think it's credible to think that people living in this country today can be expected to make the right decisions on investments that they themselves personally will make, or businesses that they will privately have to make as well. So it really does need some attention from the Chancellor. It's not just that fiscal policy alone will achieve this thing. Of course, that's not the case. But we need a fresh look at the incentives here, so that millions of people and millions of businesses start to move towards the clean technologies and the clean strategies that I talked about earlier.
Yeah. Dermot, do you want to comment on that before I move on to another topic?
I suppose just briefly, I agree with Chris. I think it's very hard to do all this. Again, the economist in me always will say, get incentives and signals right, and then you can do distribution afterwards. And I know it's not that simple. I mean, Chris's comment about the gas and electricity thing is it's just nuts. There is a part of, I mean, not Chris's comment, sorry, the situation is not.
Well, it might have been.
but there is a part of it, there is a sense of, oh my God, if we take if we put extra costs in the gas system, what will poor vulnerable people do during the depths of winter? And that's a genuine issue, but there must be other responses to it. I mean, this is sufficiently important that I think you need to make the change Chris suggested, and then find some other way to protect people who are going to be vulnerable. And that's not easy, but it's certainly not impossible, and just needs to be grasped, isn't it?
Yes,
totally agree.
Yes. Yes, it means a call for action. We will have to take some risks in taking that action, but inaction really doesn't seem to be an option. I just wanted to come on, Chris, to another point that's come through in what I've been looking at and what questions we've been asked, which is around the role of different parts of government within the UK. The NAO has come out recently, a very critical report in relation to the net zero kind of policy approach with local government. Questions come through in relation to the devolved administrations. It is, again, one of these dilemmas where one needs a strong degree of, as you've put it in your work, governance mechanisms and coordination. But equally, I think it seems to be the case that this is the space, important space perhaps, for policy innovation from, for example, from the devolved administrations. What's your sense of the opportunity there?
Well, I mean, as somebody who worked in the Scottish government for a few years, I really do feel this. I mean, I my sort of background, my first 10 years in Whitehall were in economic policy in the round. I worked on things like tax policies, corporate tax policies, those sorts of things. And then I came north and found myself working on energy policy because it was the kind of most interesting bit of economic policy in Scotland, and all this climate stuff came with that. I found myself in Scottish government when I was the director there for energy and climate, being extremely frustrated with my old chums in Whitehall because they didn't get it. They didn't understand that there was a huge prize in helping the Scottish government and the Welsh government, and in due course the Northern Irish as well, to use the levers at their disposal. Now, a lot of the levers that we have in Scotland, I'm speaking to you today from Glasgow, where I've been holed up for the last 18 months. A lot of the levers that are in Scotland are on the demand side, the thing that we've been talking about. So, changes, for example, in the built environment. I often talk about this. If we're going to be successful on this heat transition, we know we need to decarbonise heat. We know we need to do that over the next 30 years across the country, preferably sooner. If you buy a gas boiler today, it will probably be in use for about 14, 15 years. So you knock that off the 2050 date, and that means that by 2035, you've got to stop selling those gas boilers. That's the straightforward assessment. Now, that's the kind of assessment that we would make in the CCC at a national level. But the reality is it's not nearly as simple as that. It's not nearly as simple as saying, let's stop selling gas boilers. What we actually need is a plan that works for each part of the country. And of course, to get to that plan, what you really need is something that works with the changes by locale that we see across the country as you walk through it. So for a city like Glasgow, I'm sitting here in a very grand old Edwardian red sandstone tenement. I look out and I see red sandstone tenements in front of me. They don't exist anywhere else. So we'll need a plan for Glasgow, and it will be very different from the plan that we have for Teesside, for the plan for Plymouth. And I sort of feel that actually we need to run towards that. Yes, we need these nationally mandated changes in the energy system, especially. That is an essential component of achieving net zero overall. But we also need to allow the capacity to grow at a more local level, to plan the system more effectively for these changes, accepting that they are going to be different depending where you are in the country. And that means probably for a city like Glasgow that district heating is probably the best outcome, actually, if I'm honest. So you can imagine a city-wide energy system that instead of having gas network, it ran hot water around the whole city. We might get that hot water from the Clyde in Glasgow. We could take the heat from the Clyde to heat the city in a very renewable way. That's probably true for many other cities around the UK as well. But it will require Glasgow to have a plan that works with the specific buildings that we have here. So I sort of feel, Gordon, to answer your question, that we are miles away from that kind of unified strategy. We're miles away from having what you might think of as more of a kind of deployment plan for this net zero goal that's now been set up and down the country. And I also think that is a big opportunity. There's probably layers of governance that are missing at the moment. I don't think local authorities are the right level to try and build all of the capacity that we need to understand this transition. So some thinking about governance would really help. I definitely feel like the Whitehall departments are getting to that kind of outcome, that kind of thinking as well. You can see that, for example, in the recent proposals on a future system operator, which is kind of getting to the idea that you do need some sort of architect in there to start to understand these things. But there are layers of governance and layers of planning and design in the system that just don't exist at the moment. And I'm afraid they're going to span that devolved Westminster schism as well. So, we're going to need a UK-wide plan for this stuff that is going to be very difficult, I think, with devolved politics. So the sooner we get onto that grown-up discussion I talked about earlier, the better. And I'm not laying any blame at anyone's particular door, but the one thing I'll say here is that particularly on devolved politics, and this is true in Scotland, it's true in Wales, and it's true in Northern Ireland, that there's a very poor relationship between Westminster and those devolved administrations, and it is hampering progress now. So I'd love to see us think in a more expansive way about this, setting aside some of the constitutional questions, particularly in Scotland and Northern Ireland. Of course, that's difficult, but we've got to think that way because this transition is a physical one and it doesn't respect these constitutional borders. So I just would like a better plan, really, in general for those kind of regional issues, if I can put them that way.
And I guess it's a microcosm of the bigger issue, isn't it? In terms of the climate change challenge internationally, one has to find a way of putting aside differences that might exist, between different, jurisdictions, whether they're the domestic ones or the international ones.
Absolutely. It doesn't. I mean, a ton of carbon emitted. It doesn't matter where it is on the planet; it will very quickly mix and be part of the problem of global warming. So we've got to look through these boundaries that exist internationally and even within and intranationally as well.
Yes, I wanted to come on actually to one very specific, very interesting call that's come out from the committee, which I perhaps as a lawyer find could be quite interesting in terms of the practical application of it, which is the call for a net zero test, which I thought was really interesting, to ensure that all government decisions are compatible with emissions targets. Can you say a little bit more, Chris, about what you have in mind or the committee has in mind in relation to how that test would work in practice?
Yeah, so this is a new proposal from us and recommendation for us in our most recent publication, our progress report in June, but it's one that we've been thinking about for a while. And the broad idea is that net zero is such an all-encompassing goal that we really do need to think in a more all-encompassing way about how we achieve it. And I suppose the idea behind the test is that you've got this sort of the need, I suppose, to have, the governor's eyebrow. You need some sort of kind of cross-economy, cross-government check on whether what we are proposing in policy terms or in infrastructure terms makes sense in that net zero world. So it's the core of it is this idea that let's run everything that we do through this test. It's particularly about planning. So the government in Westminster is doing some planning reforms at the moment. And it's true in other parts of the country too. They're looking at planning as a topic, and that's a big opportunity to introduce this idea of a net zero test. It's also particularly about things like big infrastructure projects. We're now into the situation where many of the new infrastructure projects that are being conceived of and rolled out across the country will definitely be here with us come 2050. So it's a really obvious question. Does that make sense? Very controversial topics like road building, for example. Do we need £27 billion of investment in the trunk road network at the moment when we're moving towards net zero as a goal? And it's also about housing. It's a kind of that idea of a test would help immensely to sort out the fact that many of the new houses that we're building at the moment are not fit for net zero. They're also not fit for the changes in climate that I opened up with when I talked earlier. So this test is a sort of catch-all for all of that. It's mainly, though, and Gordon, you're a lawyer, so you'll get this. It's mainly because we see also a legal risk here, and the government is waving off and fighting several legal challenges at the moment about things like road building and Heathrow expansion, and they would be helped immensely if it was obvious and they could demonstrate that there had been a process of considering the climate impacts of every new planning application or every new infrastructure project, and that absence of a well-evidenced assessment is why they are in difficulty in many of those legal challenges at the moment. I mean, I'm not making a judgment of how those things will end up, but it would be a hell of a lot clearer if each of those projects could be said to have been green-lit, having considered net zero especially. I think also having considered the changes in climate that I talked about. So we do have more fully cooked plans that we will want to publish at some point on this recommendation, but that is the general idea, and I think it would be really helpful to be able to see what the government's thinking is project by project and how those projects fit in that net zero world that we're roaring towards, I hope. Yes,
yeah, no, that sounds really, really important. I mean, taking it to its practical on the planning side, practical extent, one wonders, applying a net zero test of the sort that you suggest, whether the sort of deliberations that go on around, for example, a new deep coal mine, whether that could possibly, in a world where you have a net zero test, whether these discussions would simply stop, or, for example, discussions around licensing new production fields in the North Sea in relation to oil and gas. Is that how you would see?
Yeah.
No, without talking about specific projects, but how you would see those becoming much more decisive episodes.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to say that we may not like it. I mean, many in the community, people who deal with climate change don't like it, but there is potentially room for projects like that in a net zero world. I mean, they're not the projects that I would push for, but I suppose the importance of the net zero test is it would force ministers to say what their plan is. So if you think it's okay to have a new coal mine in Cumbria, I mean, I would say that's mad. But if you want to do it, then at least you would be required to demonstrate in that assessment that I talked about how that fits with the strategy for the country to get to net zero. So that might, for example, flush out the idea that the government's strategy is to do more carbon capture, for example. And there's a much more debatable question about new oil and gas licensing offshore. Again, that for me doesn't fit with the kind of net zero world that we're talking about in outline, at least. But again, that would flush out the government's own view of where the oil and gas that we will need over this transition is going to come from, what their outlook is on importation and domestic production. And it's the absence of those assessments that makes it very difficult to do my job at the moment, and very difficult, I think, for people in the country to know what to do about these issues as well. And I think these legal challenges are going to keep coming. So I think until there is something that looks like that legal test that I talked about, the government's going to find itself in increasing difficulties unless it can spell out exactly what it's planning to do.
Gordon, could I come in just briefly on that? I mean, I do recall, without sparing Chris's blushes, I do recall when the coal mine was announced that Lord Deben, the chair of the Climate Change Committee, was on Newsnight that evening and being a very polite man, and the interviewer pressing him to say, Lord Deben, is this not absolutely completely insane? He managed to avoid doing that, while I think making his feelings actually quite clear. And yet it did bring something to me. Cumbria is a poor area of the country. There's unemployment is very high. Regional policy is really important there. And it seemed a hugely attractive thing, I'd imagine, for the people of Cumbria. I think the net test, as Chris says, will force government, and how to implement it is going to be difficult, but in principle, will force government to make these kinds of decisions beforehand. Regional policy, employment are hugely important issues. And yet, if there's a net test, they'll at least have to confront that ex ante before the kind of completely non-joined-up policy we saw in the case of the coal mine. And regional policy is hugely important, and they'll have to find a way to support Cumbria and the people in it, but probably in a way that doesn't involve doing something that is so contrary to general disruptive climate change policy. A very final comment, I'm conscious of time, on governance. There is an element of me that accepts this might be A, deck chairs than the Titanic, and B, just create more time and hassle. But I'm not sure if the intersection of bays and energy has been that successful. I think there was talk of a Department of Climate Change that would be taken seriously, have a senior minister, have a strong relationship with the Treasury. In principle, I think that would be a good idea if it could be done with non-costlessly, which of course is very difficult. I don't know if that would be, it would just delay things even further, but I do think current governance arrangements in Whitehall are far from perfect.
I think we'd probably find a lot of agreement with that. So in the last couple of minutes this morning, I think it's only right that I give Chris the chance just to make some closing comments on the work of the committee, that looking ahead towards the autumn, and perhaps looking also ahead to the COP in Chrissy's hometown. Not that long ahead, to look. So, Chris, if you wouldn't mind just sort of giving us some closing thoughts, that would be fantastic. Well,
I think you've put your finger on it, really. The focus is now going to move to COP26. I mean, I don't think that most people living in the country today have yet clocked how big a deal this is, actually. And you can, I mean, I'm in Glasgow, and you can sort of feel the city suddenly aware of the fact that the tension is now shifting towards it. I've just agreed to do 2 weeks of New York Times stuff, in what I know is to be a nightclub in Glasgow. So it's just sort of a striking reminder that actually that everything's going to shift and change in for those 2 weeks in November, and it does look like we'll have the Pope and we'll have 190 world leaders here in Glasgow for that conference, and it is absolutely essential that we achieve something in COP26. And the first point to make is that, like it or not, the eyes of the world will be on what the UK is doing about all of this. And these little issues like Cumbrian coal mines, which might not seem a big deal, really are a big deal. Joe Biden raised it with the Prime Minister when he met him earlier in this year. So I think probably the Prime Minister is now aware of the tension that is on the UK for these things. I mean, those little mistakes, if I can put them that way, and I'm not sure I would use that term too widely, but I think that mistakes like that will cost us dear. I think we will not be in a position to be a credible president of the COP unless we have really sorted out our strategy on climate. And the absence of that strategy is a glaring omission at the moment. I mean, I called it a policy vacuum when I made my comments in June, and I meant that because it's the absence of the policy is now meaning that space is being filled by more nefarious voices, if I can put it that way, on climate. And you see that happening now. Lots of it unevidenced, but really problematic. So I hope the government really leans into this strategy. I hope the Chancellor also leans into it, because the economics of this are so positive, actually, if we tackle it. You saw that in the recent OBR report. If we get those things right, then the path to COP26 is going to be an easier one for us as the president, because there's lots of things that we've done right over the recent times here in the UK. We do have something to offer, I think, the wider community. But the task in Glasgow is going to be, yes, net zero by mid-century. Looks very much like things are coming into line with that overall goal now as we look globally. But we also need something in the short term. That's the 2030 commitments. We also need the corporate commitments that go with that and help world leaders feel confident about this transition. There's going to be a big focus on that in Glasgow, I think. The energy transition that goes with it is I think, an area where the UK has something to offer and to talk about. The finance for this, be that the funding for the developing world or the financial markets that will mobilise the capital for this transition overall, is another big UK strength. And then let's not forget climate change itself and the climate risks, because we will need a well-adapted economy, well-adapted world to the changes in the climate that are, I'm afraid, on the way. So it's such a big moment for Glasgow, and such a big moment for the UK in hosting it, and such a big moment for the globe. And you have to hope, and I do hope, that actually things are going to come together nicely. There's a lot riding on this for the UN. They need to demonstrate that a multilateral approach is back after the pandemic. There's a lot riding on it for Boris and the UK post-Brexit as a demonstration of the UK's place in the world. And of course, there's a lot riding on it as we emerge, and I hope we are emerging from this pandemic. This is the kind of big moment, I suppose, for things to come together. So it's a bit more than just a climate summit. I really do feel like it's a sort of a pretty unique moment, actually, in geopolitics. And all of that resting on my hometown, Glasgow, hosting a good show. So it should be a hell of a few months.
Well, if there's any city that's capable of rising to the challenge, I'm sure it's Glasgow. So and those are great closing remarks, Chris. Thank you so much for that, and thank you to Dermot for sharing your observations with us as well. So I'll now bring this webinar to a close, and thank Chris and Dermot for their time this morning, and to everyone who's joined us. Thank you very much.